that people don't want to talk about, that this is right and this is wrong. And if you do this, then it's the right thing to do. And if you do that, it's the wrong thing to do. Yet there has to be those standards. They have to exist in some fashion. I've mentioned before that when I was a younger man, I once debated a lady who was named Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She was the woman, for those who are old enough to remember, who had taken it all the way to the Supreme Court to get prayer thrown out of public schools. And in the course of my debating her, which was not my choice, by the way, I didn't seek to debate her. She was coming to town and the radio station invited me to come and debate her on the radio. When I asked her, if you don't believe that there is a God, if you don't believe there are absolute standards of right and wrong, then how can you know what's right and wrong? For example, how can you know it's wrong to murder? She said, as a mother, I give life, and therefore I know it's wrong to take life. Therefore, I don't need your morals, I don't need your rules. I just know that inherently because I'm a mother. I was too young to be quick on my feet to answer her back then. Have you ever had a debate or a conversation with somebody and after it was over, you thought of all the things you should have said? As a matter of fact, they said that's true of everybody who does any kind of public speaking, including sermons. There are 3 sermons you preach: the one you prepare, the one you give, and then the good one, the one you give on the way home. Thinking of, I should have said that differently, I should have covered that point. I later wished I had been sharp enough to say, if that is correct, Mrs. O'Hare, what about the mothers who killed their children? Doesn't that just completely do away with your system? Oh, and then we've evolved to this, that people don't do things wrong anymore. They don't sin. They just make mistakes. Have you noticed that? If somebody does something terribly wrong, I made a mistake. I think making a mistake is something that you do accidentally. You've done it before. You've gotten into your car, you headed off to the store, and the next thing you knew, you were at your office. Because of the fact that just in your mind, you just did what you automatically always do. Well, that's a mistake. You didn't mean to do it. It was an accident. And most of the things that people in our era call mistakes are not mistakes at all because they very much do them on purpose. I know what I'm doing. I've chosen to do it. And then if they get caught, or if they reap some kind of a negative consequence, then it's like, well, I made a mistake. I don't know about you, but that irritates me personally. I would love for people to just finally say, I did it, it was wrong. Please forgive me, I'm sorry. Rather than trying to justify it or rationalize it or say, I made a mistake. You didn't make a mistake. You did it on purpose. It was just flat wrong. Now, this psalm we're going to be reading about covers that idea. And by the way, it would be applicable to everybody today because people still sin, whether we want to talk about it in our culture or not. Romans 3 still says that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. It still says that no one is perfect. None. And so even the people who sit on our pews, the people who come here who are the salt of the earth, I'll guarantee you there are people sitting in this room right now who have sinned, perhaps even in the last 24 hours, if not in the last week. Or whatever, because nobody ever reaches sinless perfection. You don't get to the point. You say, well, can people live absolutely without sin? Yes. People in comas, they live absolutely without sin. They can lie there for weeks or even months or years and never do a thing wrong. But those of us who are awake, who are aware, who have our capabilities, we still face the temptations. We still do the things that we shouldn't do. But what bothers me is, after a while, you can become so acclimated to your sin. I've done it so often that after a while, you feel no guilt at all. Now, I say you as if it's just true of you, but it's true of me. It's true of everybody, that we can do this thing, and if we repetitively do it, after a while, there's little to no guilt, and we can even justify it. Other people justify their sin by saying, well, the ends justify the means. If you look back in the case of Jesus, for example, once they had convinced themselves, those people who were anti-Jesus, opposed to Jesus as he lived on the earth, once they convinced themselves that he was of the devil, as a matter of fact, that's what they said. They said he had a demon. He worked miracles. And because they couldn't explain how he could work miracles, they said he does it by the power of Beelzebub. He does it by the power of Satan. Now, that really irritated Jesus. It was the only time he ever dealt with any sin this way. He looked at those people who accused him of that, saying that I did it by the power of the devil. Well, you've just blasphemed the Holy Spirit. Not just God the Father, not just me the Son, you've blasphemed the Spirit. And then he said, you will never be forgiven for what you just did. Sometimes we refer to it as the unpardonable sin. Now, we don't have time to explain in detail what that means, but I want you to understand that those people on that occasion did something so blatantly wrong and knew They were blatantly wrong, to the point that he said to them, don't even think about being repentant. Don't even think about being forgiven. You will never be forgiven for what you just did. But because they convinced themselves that he was of the devil, because they were now convincing other people of that, when it came time to try him so they could convict him and have the Romans execute him, men actually came to the front and lied. They lied about what they said that Jesus did. Well, how could they justify their lying? I mean, they were doing it in the name of God. How could they justify their lying in the name of God? It's because they convinced themselves that he was evil. And once they convinced themselves that he was evil, they could justify anything that they did to stop the evil. And so there are people who commit sins who are convinced they didn't sin at all because they did it allegedly in the name of God. There are people who have become so used to their sin they feel no guilt, therefore they think they don't sin at all. And then there's some people who just feel so blooming self-righteous that surely God is with me and I do not sin at all. It was to those people that in the book of James, James would say, and by the way, I think this passage is most often used out of context, but in context what he said is this: if you do this sin thinking, but at least I didn't do that sin, therefore I'm okay because the sin I did is not as bad as that one that I could have done or that other people do. That's when he said, if you're guilty of one part of the law, you're guilty of all the law. As I said, many people use it out of context. But what he was saying is you can't justify. You can't just pick and choose and say, but my sin is not as bad as yours. Now, in this particular psalm, Psalm 38, is one of the 6 psalms that Christendom has typically seen as the penitent psalms. They're written by David. And these are psalms that David writes about his own guilt. Now, this particular psalm that we're about to read is kind of a mystery in some sense. Let me explain. Like Psalm 51, a psalm we may look at later, not today, but in Psalm 51, David would talk about the guilt he felt and that he actually had because of what he had done with Bathsheba. He had committed adultery with her. In addition to having committed adultery, he had also had her husband Uriah killed. And in the 51st Psalm, he writes that psalm after he'd been confronted by the prophet with his sin. He knew what he had done wrong, and in great penitence, he writes about his pain for the guilt that he felt. Now, in Psalm 38, in Psalm 38, we don't know what he did. This is not about Bathsheba. It's about something, but the sin itself is not mentioned. There's another kind of mystery that goes with this psalm because of the fact that in the psalm, the commentators, the people who try to interpret Scripture, they look at this and go, well, he certainly appears to be physically sick as well as eaten up by guilt. Therefore, they read it saying he's also been afflicted by God with some disease. And so here he is struggling with his disease as well as struggling with his guilt. My opinion is that that's incorrect. My opinion is that the people who think that are people who have never struggled with great guilt. That people who have felt great guilt would not see this as being some disease he was struck with and also guilt for sin, but that the two things are intertwined. That his illness is a direct result of his guilt. Not of his sin per se, but of his guilt. Now, that's my opinion. As we read the text, you can choose to accept that or not. The Psalms are music. What they do is those were songs that people sang. They were actually poetry that people would sing back in that day and time. But if you think about it, the songs that we sing today are poetry as well. Look at the rhymes of the songs that we sing. And they would follow certain particular patterns. So when they would write the poems, they would write them to particular poetic patterns. And so we're not in any way saying the Holy Spirit wasn't involved. Of course he was. But he also would use the psalmist, and he here would express his emotion in great detail. And some of the most powerful songs, the songs that live through history, are the songs that express great and deep emotions. The song Amazing Grace, for example, written by a man who'd been a captain of a slave ship. Later in his life, he becomes a Christian. Now, he chose a tune to write it to. Interestingly, the tune to Amazing Grace was a bar song that was used back in those day and times, but he needed to borrow a melody. Apparently, he didn't know how to write one. And so he took words that indicated the great pain he felt for what he had done. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I found, was blind, but now I see. Now, this is a poem like that. It's a song. As a matter of fact, probably the closest correlations today, and I don't mean to be blasphemous at all, would be country music, where the singers just pour their emotions into it. This is what I feel. And so now, I don't have time to read the psalm. All right, let's see if we can get it. In Psalm 38, and if we don't finish today, we'll just try to put it over to next week, Lord willing. A Psalm of David, meaning David was the one who wrote it. He didn't write all the Psalms. A petition. In other words, he's begging God. He starts with, O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. For your arrows have pierced me, and your hand has come down upon me. Because of your wrath, there is no health in my body. My bones have no soundness because of my sin. My guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear. My wounds fester and are loathsome because of my sinful folly. I am bowed down and brought low. All day long I go about mourning. Let's just stop. What did he say? Well, he's talked about the fact that he feels like he has wounds that are festering. That's kind of an ugly picture. We won't dwell on that, but you can understand what he's saying there. He said he felt as if there was no strength in his bones. That, as a matter of fact, he, in this penitent psalm and in other penitent psalms like Psalm 32, he'll refer to his bones again. To the fact that he feels like that they have not only no strength, but they feel like that they're breaking within him. He's talking about tremendous and amazing pain that he feels. Now, he tied it directly to his guilt. If you paid attention to that, he said that back in verse 3. Because of your wrath, there's no health in my body. My bones have no soundness because of my sin. Now, it's true that we can commit certain sins that will definitely have physical effects on us. I recall a man once that I went over to teach because he knew he was dying. He was dying of cirrhosis of the liver. They'd already given him his prognosis about how long he probably had left to live. He had cirrhosis of his liver because of the fact that he had been drinking all of his life. Since actually he was a boy, he had been drinking. And he called for me to come visit with him, and I did, to sit down to discuss the possibility of whether there is a God. And if God does exist, what would his fate be? Now, he was feeling guilt because of the things he had done in his life. At the same time, he didn't know exactly what to do about those things. And he, like David, could have said, my bones have no soundness because of my sin. Or in his case, he would have said, my liver has no soundness because of my sin. Basically, some people can say that. It's because of the things that I have done wrong that I am in the shape that I'm in. I still think with David, what he's talking about is what his guilt's doing to him. So if we skip down to verse 7. In verse 7 he says, my back is filled with searing pain. There's no health in my body. I am feeble and utterly crushed. I groan in anguish of heart. Anybody ever felt that bad? Am I the only person here that at least at some point in life felt so much guilt about things I knew I was doing wrong or things I knew I had done wrong, that the guilt was literally crushing? I know, I've been there, that it literally crushed me, where physically it felt as if my bones were breaking inside of me. It felt as if everything in my body was going to pieces, and there was no peace whatsoever in my mind, no peace whatsoever in my heart. Now, I'm assuming I'm not the only person in this room who has felt that kind of guilt. You say, is it good to feel that kind of guilt? In my opinion, yes. Let me explain why. People who can do things wrong and not feel guilty about them are either sociopaths or psychopaths. Now, we can look at that for people who just misuse other people. There was a fellow several years ago when I was running a different nonprofit who worked for me that he'd already been in jail. I'd helped get him out through giving him a job, actually, and then he stole $7,000 from our nonprofit. As I was talking to his wife, as I was dismissing him, maybe you think I'm harsh, but once they steal $7,000, it's time for him to go. As I was discussing this with his wife, she said, oh yes, the psychiatrist who evaluated him said he has no ability to understand how his actions affect other people. He cannot understand the emotions you feel when he hurts you. Therefore, his doc said that he is a sociopath. Well, I think there are people who are spiritual sociopaths as well. These are people who continually do things that are wrong, and they don't seem to have any comprehension of how they affect other people in the spiritual realms, particularly when they can justify it before God. I am standing before God when I do this. God is blessing me, although they have no comprehension, or at least seem to have no ability to feel the effect of their actions on the people that they hurt. Now, when David talks about this, I've grown, I hurt, I'm in pain. If a person can feel guilt, then the person actually has a spiritual advantage. You say, what do you mean? Okay, I've said this before, so forgive me for my redundancy. Oh, as if anybody would remember. But guilt does in the spiritual realm what pain does in the physical realm. By the way, as I've already said, I think that they are connected, that sometimes one affects the other. But let me see if I can explain better. If, for example, you could feel no physical pain, you would be in trouble. You might be thinking, well, no, that would be great. If I could feel no physical pain, I'd never have a headache. That's right. And if somebody stabbed you with a knife, you wouldn't feel that either. You say, great, no pain. You understand, if you don't have the ability to feel pain, you're going to wind up doing great damage to your body, because what pain is designed to do in the physical sense is to say something is wrong, fix it. That's why if you were to sit down on a hot stove, and by the way, I don't know why anybody would, but if you were to sit down on a hot stove, you would instantly jump up because you would feel pain. Now, what if you didn't feel pain and you sat on a hot stove? If you could feel no pain, you would cook. People would have rump roast. And so what would happen is then we need the ability. Richard Rogers, there's been more than one guy named Richard Rogers in our brotherhood who was a preacher, but the Richard Rogers who was associated with Sunset School of Preaching many years ago before his death talked about being in countries where that there were lepers, and he said and the lepers, understand leprosy covers many different skin diseases. It's not just a disease. There's several that would go into that category, basically. He talked about being in a country where there were lepers, and these people were outcast. They couldn't come inside because of the potential contagion. And he said, in the countries where I've been, where there are lepers, many of them don't have their digits. They are missing parts or all of their fingers or parts of all of their toes. He said the reason for that, and I'm going to be very brief with this because it's pretty gross. He said the reason for that is when they're outside and they're asleep at night and the rodents come, they cannot feel it. They wake up and part of themselves are gone. Pain in the physical realm says something's wrong, fix it. Guilt in the spiritual realm does the same thing. It says, I have a problem. Something is wrong here, and this needs to be fixed. Therefore, I think guilt is a good thing. You say even guilt to this point. I think guilt to that point is valid when it's telling us that something desperately is wrong and must be corrected. You say, well, okay, so as soon as God forgives me then all the guilt goes away. Well, unfortunately, I'm out of time. May I have your permission to finish the psalm next week? Would that be okay? Y'all mind if I come back next week? Would that be all right? Let me see if I can finish up the illustration here. It just took more time than I expected. Many years ago, and I'm going to end with this illustration to explain what I've talked about so far. Most people who attend this church know that Alice and I have been married to each other twice. That we were married to each other for 15 years, and then we divorced, and I went off and lived like a hellion for 3 years. Did many, many bad things in those 3 years. By the grace of God, Alice forgave me and took me back, and we remarried each other in 1987. People sometimes say, did you tell Alice all the things you did during those 3 years? I told her everything she asked about. I've said this before, so forgive me for being redundant again, but here's the deal I made with Alice. I'll tell you anything you want to know as long as you really want to know it. What I mean by that is if I tell you something, I cannot untell you. Once it's out there forever. So when you ask me a question, sometimes I'm going to ask you back, do you really want to know the answer to that question? Sometimes she'd think about it and she'd go, no, I really don't want to know the answer to that question. What she wanted to know, and you can understand this, what she wanted to know is that there were no things I would hide from her. That everything was available to her if she wanted to know it. You see the point here, because that's the only way she would trust me again. There was one thing that I specifically asked Alice, can I not tell you this one? And she gave me permission, so I never have. Actually, it's the worst thing I ever did. And if you're thinking, oh my goodness, he's going to tell us. No, I'm not. By the standards of the world, it's no big deal. I literally could go on the Today Show and say I did it, and people would go, huh. But it's just, to me, the worst thing I ever did. Therefore, I don't talk about it. You understand? It happened in the fall of the year. Now, Alice and I had remarried and gotten back together, but every fall of the year, I had tremendous physical problems. Now, I've told this story a gazillion times. It's in one of my books, etc., but just allow me to say it here. I was in Phoenix doing something for Sears. That's back when I used to do a lot of corporate stuff, which was very lucrative. I enjoyed that quite a bit, but my health was deteriorating. It was debilitating me. You see, because just as pain in the physical world says something's wrong, fix it, if the pain is perpetual, it will completely shut you down. It will stop you. People who live in constant pain wind up being unable to do anything. Have you ever seen that? For example, two of the most charismatic people I ever met in my life was, one was Bear Bryant, had unbelievable charisma. For those who remember football, Bear Bryant was a coach at the University of Alabama. The other was a guy who was governor of Alabama, a guy named George Wallace. Now, whatever you think of his politics, just let me say that the man dripped charisma. Met him when I was 18 years old. That was the first time. I met him again later, and both times the man was dripping with charisma. The last time I met him, I was speaking for a church in Birmingham, Alabama. They had a big push that day. They were trying to have the biggest crowd they'd ever had. They had brought in a guest speaker. I happened to be that speaker, and lo and behold, the former governor of Alabama, George Wallace, showed up. He was in a wheelchair. You may remember when he was running for president many years ago, he was shot, he was crippled, he was debilitated, he was in constant pain. I was beside the local minister when the local minister said, we're really glad to have you here today. He said, oh yeah, I know who Joe is, which I thought was shocking. Do you remember me from back when? He didn't. Because he could no longer sleep at night because of his pain. He'd been listening to me on the radio in Montgomery. I did a 10 p.m. Sunday night call-in radio program about Bible. And because the man couldn't sleep, he had heard it. So that's how he knew who I was. Oh, okay. I watched the man twist around in his wheelchair in unbelievable pain. Interestingly, just in case you want to know, he made an interesting statement to the local minister. He said, being shot was the best thing that ever happened to me. He said, it saved my soul. Now, I don't know, we didn't pry. I can't tell you any more than that, but I thought that was a fascinating statement from the man. I looked at him, constant pain, debilitated. That's why he actually fell asleep when I was speaking, because he was drugged. I keep telling myself that. It was the chemicals. Constant pain will shut you down physically. Constant guilt will shut you down spiritually. And is there a correlation? So I'm at Sears. I'm in Phoenix doing a thing for Sears. I called Alice back. I said, it's getting worse. I can barely function. It was the fall of the year. It always happened in the fall of the year. Every year it got worse than the year before. I said, you've got to find me another doctor because the one I'm using now doesn't seem to know how to help me. And I said, I want to be very young and know everything. So she found me a doctor. I got home. She said, I got you a new doctor. His name's Daniel Boone. Actually a descendant of the real Daniel Boone. I went to see him. I'm sitting there. The nurse tells me to take my shirt off in that little room. I don't, because I know he's not coming for a while. You know how that works. I looked over, and there was a book by Max Lucado, so I'm thumbing through it. Daniel comes blowing through the room. He always blew through the door like Kramer on Seinfeld. He came blowing into the room. I'm reading the book. He said, it's a great book. I said, Max is a good guy. He said, you know Max? I said, yes. He said, you Church of Christ? I said, not all of it. So We got into a conversation. He went through test after test over week, test after test after test, and finally I came back. It's still getting worse. I'm being debilitated. And he looks me in the eye and he said, I thought it was lupus, but it's not that. I thought it was this, but it's not that. I thought it was that, but it's not that. He said, I finally think I know what's wrong with you. I know what's destroying you physically. What? It's guilt. Guilt is eating you alive. It's destroying your body. He said, this is a spiritual problem, not a medical problem. That'll be $75. Not long after that, I was speaking for a group of students, college students associated with the University of Kentucky, a Christian student center there. They had done it out at a state park in Kentucky. One of their church elders, a guy named Jim Leake, was there. Jim said, you look in pretty bad shape. I said, it's getting worse and worse. He said, let's go for a walk. I can't walk far. We went a little piece down this trail. There was an old cabin in that state park. There were 2 rocking chairs on the front porch. We sat on the rocking chairs. He said, so what is it? What's destroying your body? I said, my doc says it's guilt. He said, what do you feel guilty about? Oh, I've never told anybody about this. It happened about this time of year. Somehow I trusted him, and I told him. Then he asked an interesting question. He said, have you ever cried over your sin? I said, look, I don't cry much, but I'm really very sorry about what I did. And then he did this most amazing thing. Now, you understand, I had confessed my sin. God knew about it already because God sees everything. I talked to God about it on many occasions, but the guilt was still destroying me. And this amazing thing happened on the day because Jim Leake leaned over and put his hand on my knee and looked me in the eye and said, I forgive you. Now, it doesn't make sense. He didn't even know me when I did it. You understand? Why should he forgive me? It's totally irrelevant. It makes no sense at all, and I collapsed. I sobbed like a child. He actually reached over and he held me. And I began to get well that day. Now, I didn't heal instantly, but the process of healing began because the guilt was finally dealt with. You say, but God had long since forgiven you. There's a difference in God forgiving you so that you have no legal guilt, and you forgiving you so that you have no emotional guilt. Can you see the difference in those two things? He said, so what happened? Well, first of all, I confessed it out loud to another person. That's actually in the Bible, believe it or not. It actually says Joe should confess to Jim. It didn't say it just like that. It's in James chapter 5. It said if you're sick, you call for the elders who will come with oil to anoint you. And then it says confess your sins one to another and pray one for another that you may be healed. And then the King James says the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. What it's saying is, through that process of confession, a healing begins to take place. Does it always heal your body? Not necessarily, because there may be other things going on with the body. But it will heal your heart. It will heal your soul. And if that's the guilt that's destroying your body, then your body actually gets well as well. And he says, and if you've sinned, your sins will be forgiven. If you understand the concept of grace in the New Testament, my understanding of what James says there is the sin's already been forgiven by God. Now it's going to be forgiven by me. I'm actually going to let it go. And the healing starts. Now there's a lot more to that psalm. And we'll talk about that next week, Lord willing. But here's my question. Are you a sinner? Oh, and don't think it has to be murder or adultery or addiction or whatever top 10 sin you want to pick. It can be cheating on your income tax. It could be lying. It could be gossiping. It could be sowing discord. It could be any number of things. If that is what you are doing and you do not feel guilty, then pray God to convict you of your sin. And then when the guilt comes, pray God that he will forgive and heal so you can have peace within. And if, like I did, you need someone to look you in the eye and say, I forgive you, we'll do that for you if you give yourself to God. If you wish to do that, you can either come to one of these front chairs and sit down, and we will pray with you. Or if you feel like it's just way too private, then some of our shepherds will be standing around the back. You just go back and see them, and hopefully some other wives will be with them in case it's a woman who needs to talk to a woman. But we can start dealing with guilt today. Now. Right now. When we stand and sing.
Change my heart, oh.